Mena-Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Think Tank.
A warm welcome, dear viewers, to this special edition of Mena-Watch Talks. It is a great pleasure for us to welcome Heiko Heinisch today. Heiko Heinisch is a historian and also a member of the Scientific Advisory Board of the Documentation Center for Political Islam in Vienna. Heiko Heinisch, alongside Nina Scholz, has authored several books on the topic, notably Islamism and various related subjects, including the book Europe, Human Rights, Islam, A Cultural Struggle, which was published in 2012. Following that was the book Charlie vs. Mohammed, A Plea for Freedom of Speech, and most recently, just a few years ago, All for Allah, How Political Islam Changes Our Society. And the reason for our discussion today is this very book. Together with Nina Scholz and Gustav Kustenau, he has just recently published the book Political Islam, a hybrid threat of the Muslim Brotherhood civilization jihad, just a few days ago. And that's what we want to talk a little bit about in today's conversation. So first of all, a warm welcome, Heiko. It's great that you could make the time.
Yeah, thanks for the invite.
Perhaps to start with the basics, since it's already in the title, in the subtitle, what exactly is civilization jihad? What should we understand by that?
That is a term that was developed by cadres of the Muslim Brotherhood themselves to describe their project of transforming societies into Islamic societies in the long term. So, in fact, it's about something like a cultural struggle against all societies that are not Islamic in their understanding of the term.
And you mentioned that this is a term they themselves coined. It originates from a strategic document they had drafted.
Exactly. It comes from the 1991 strategy paper of the American Muslim Brotherhood. In it, they portray their project as transforming America, the United States of America, or even all of North America into an Islamic society using the term civilization jihad, or more precisely, the civilization jihadist project.
Mm-hmm. And it's important to emphasize, you just mentioned, we talked about this strategy paper from the USA. However, there are several such papers. So what we will be discussing over the next 45 minutes to an hour isn't just some conspiratorial fantasy. It's firmly based on actual documents, on strategy papers from the Muslim Brotherhood itself.
Precisely. We base our work on several Muslim Brotherhood papers, specifically two strategy documents. One was penned 9 years prior in Europe. These two documents are essentially secret papers, discovered by chance during house searches only in the 2000s. That means they are not intended for the public, so you can't consider them propaganda or anything like that. They are papers that were addressed to the cadres of the Brotherhood. But there are also writings, including from the chief ideologue or spiritual rector of the Muslim Brotherhood, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who passed away in 2022. He actually wrote a book also back in the 90s on the Islamic movement during the upcoming phase. The book is titled The Islamic Movement in the Coming Phase. There too, he essentially lays out a strategy for how societies should be transformed.
Now, the Muslim Brotherhood has been mentioned several times. That's a term that some may be familiar with, but many still are not. Broadly speaking, what is the Muslim Brotherhood?
That's now a bit more difficult to describe because it's not simply just one organization. The Muslim Brotherhood itself, or what we perceive it to be, actually possesses a hybrid character inherently. So, on the one hand, we have a cadre apparatus that was founded in Egypt in the late 1920s, truly a strictly hierarchical cadre organization, you see. That still exists today. Parallel to that, we have organizations in Europe that were founded in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even after that by Muslim brothers, where we can say not all members in these organizations are Muslim brothers. Many of them, like the Muslim Youth in Germany, are a prime example founded by the Muslim Brotherhood, a recruitment pool, a training ground for cadres. And then we have organizations that are ideologically influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood. We have entire Muslim communities that are influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood. This means that they uphold the ideology of political Islam without being directly affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. Beyond that, it's now basically a worldwide movement. What this Yusuf al-Qaradawi means by the Islamic movement are so a movement genuinely influenced by the Brotherhood. And alongside that, we also have states, state actors that support the Muslim Brotherhood financially, propagandistically, and logistically. Primarily, one would have to mention Qatar, Kuwait, and Turkey.
So, on the one hand, we have something like a clear structure with cadres, especially in Egypt and in Arab countries.
Also in Europe, we have this cadre structure found in Arab countries. It's present here too. It's just much harder to identify them here nowadays because in the 70s they stopped officially calling themselves the Muslim Brotherhood. But this cadre structure remains. However, surrounding it, anthropologist Florence Berger-Blackler refers to it as a frériste milieu. It's quite challenging to translate into German, a fraternal, brotherhood-like environment. And this environment, in effect, is what we must consider the main actor today.
So, apart from the cadre structure, it's also simply a kind of political Islamic vision, or...
Yes, you can probably compare it to the leftist movements in Europe in the 1960s. On the one hand, you had the K groups, really strict, disciplined cadre organizations, but alongside them, there was also a large, broader leftist movement that wasn't necessarily directly affiliated with these organizations, but essentially pursued very similar goals.
Let's turn to the book in a more specific sense. You've taken a somewhat unusual approach for such a book, in that you analyze the entire subject through the lens of a particular concept, one that is actually quite infrequently used in the ongoing discussions about the Muslim Brotherhood. You're talking about a hybrid war, and that's a term that is quite infrequently used. So why exactly is that the case? Why choose this particular term? And what specifically does hybrid signify here? And as a follow-up, in what way is the Muslim Brotherhood a hybrid actor?
We began by poring over all these documents from the Muslim Brotherhood, meticulously examining their strategies. Through this, we came to realize that the strategy pursued by the Muslim Brotherhood aligns exceptionally well with this concept of hybrid warfare, or more broadly, hybrid conflict management. It was originally developed to describe governmental entities or the actions undertaken by state actors. A simple example is Russia. What does hybridity mean? An actor that operates in a hybrid way blurs the lines between friend and foe, between civilian and military. So all these boundaries that typically apply in a conventional war just no longer really play any role here. Quite the opposite. If you look at Europe now, you see undersea cables being destroyed coincidentally. There are acts of sabotage on railway tracks, troll armies on the internet trying to control discussions and discourse on social media, and steer them in certain directions. And it's not possible to directly attribute all of this to just one actor. There is a prevailing suspicion that Russia is behind all these events. But they don't confess to it. This means they're not saying, we're the ones attacking you and deliberately destroying your infrastructure, trying to stir up public sentiment in your society. So, with hybridity, the adversary remains unrevealed as such for a long time. This makes any counter-reaction incredibly challenging because you simply don't know what you're actually supposed to be reacting to. Applied to a non-state actor like the Muslim Brotherhood. Jihadist groups making attacks are clearly recognizable as enemies. So that they say, we are attacking you, we're planting a bomb, we're driving a truck into a Christmas market, whatever. We also have quite clear structures for how to react to such things. Our security agencies know how to deal with that. But dealing with an actor like the Muslim Brotherhood, which does not do that, is extremely difficult because you don't know at what level this is really an attack or not an attack and how you're supposed to counter it. And this similarity in their approach, it simply sprang to mind. It was just undeniably obvious to us. It's just that their fields of action are different from those where a state actor operates. The Muslim Brotherhood, at least, isn't destroying any infrastructure yet. It doesn't operate in cyberspace, which is also a domain where state actors operate. It operates in other spheres of action. That means we attempted to apply this theory of hybrid conflict to a non-state actor such as the Muslim Brotherhood. We aim to pinpoint the various fields in which the Muslim Brotherhood is active, and then to examine closely how they conduct themselves within each of those specific fields. And these different fields of action already express the hybridity of the conflict. So there are various societal areas in which the Muslim Brotherhood is active, and it's quite difficult to recognize this as a collaborative interplay. So to recognize that this is, in principle, a concerted attack waged from various different sides, because in the various fields of action, the governmental and societal responsibilities are simply quite different. That's precisely what a hybrid actor capitalizes on. And during our work, it struck us that this concept can truly be applied very effectively to an actor like the Muslim Brotherhood.
Perhaps at this point, another question which again concerns the structure, but in what way is the Muslim Brotherhood an actors? Can you even say that?
That's a good question because it's actually difficult to define it that way. But based on our observations of what they've been doing in Europe since the 1950s, we believe we can prove that it can indeed be seen as a single actor. Because, as mentioned, we have this cadre apparatus in the background that evidently develops strategy papers for its cadres who then actively engage in various organizations without explicitly identifying themselves as members of the Muslim Brotherhood, and who manage to get diverse organizations to actively engage in line with their overarching strategy. And this acting in accordance with the Muslim Brotherhood strategy, I believe we can demonstrate this for the first two phases. That's another aspect of the hybrid conflict I haven't mentioned yet. It unfolds in several phases, which perhaps we can also discuss later. And the advantage we had when creating the concept and also writing the book was that these first two phases of this hybrid conflict are essentially, the first one is already fully concluded and the second is approaching its end. In some countries, we're already in the third phase. This means we have not only their strategy papers, but also their actions from the last 70 years in Europe, which unmistakably demonstrate their adherence to the strategy they've developed, and that unequivocally aligns with hybrid warfare.
That's also evident with a few individuals who consistently reappear, sometimes even across different countries. I mean, there's that one person who first builds up Muslim Brotherhood structures in Germany or Austria, then goes to the US and then builds up the Muslim Brotherhood structures in the US. Also, it's always the same key players who are involved again and again, like who are active.
That's noticeable, and that's absolutely right. So there are a few, let's say, nodes in the network, a few central players, central cadres, who do indeed appear in different countries. We also have this, we might even get to discuss Austria later, where someone who presumably played a significant role in the initial phase of the Islamic religious community in Austria simultaneously played a major role in establishing the Islamic Center Munich, which was one of the first and largest centers of the Muslim Brotherhood in Europe.
We'll definitely get to discuss Austria. As you've already mentioned, hybrid conflicts or hybrid warfare are divided into phases, and that's how you've structured it in the book as well. You essentially divide it into 5 distinct phases. So let's go ahead and describe these phases. How can one envision them? What exactly defines their characteristics?
Indeed, we actually adopted these phases directly from the theory of hybrid warfare and have largely retained them just as they were originally described there. We just have different fields of action playing a role in each phase. The first phase is priming, or the preparation phase, which we called settlement. We took that term directly from one of the strategy papers, so it's basically about settling in. One first establishes themselves in the country, building initial structures, setting up primary bases, and then begins to gather information. So in the initial phase, one operates in a highly adaptable way. You don't really know your way around the country just yet. This means that you try to analyze the structures within the country. So how exactly do I even go about establishing my own structures here? What is the legal situation like, and so forth? And then by the end of the first phase, you have a small initial organizational network that has been established, which you can then use to proceed to the second phase.
And now, from a historical standpoint, how would you classify this initial phase specifically in Austria and Germany?
Right, and it's important to add that these phases are very long-term. In hybrid warfare, things generally tend to happen somewhat more quickly. For an actor like the Muslim Brotherhood, their fundamental objective isn't about seizing territory like in warfare, where one would occupy and hold a piece of land. Instead, their entire endeavor is focused on transforming society from its very foundations. So the ultimate goal in this hybrid conflict is also completely different. In this initial stage, these stages tend to be quite prolonged. So we can roughly delineate this initial phase as spanning from the nascent period of the 1950s all the way up to the 1980s. In the 1980s, it transitions into the second phase, which has lasted until about today. So we can say the first phase lasted about 30 years and the second about 40 years. We must also assume that the subsequent phases are likewise designed for the long term by the Muslim Brotherhood itself, because their overall project ultimately depends on the number of Muslims in each specific country. So during the 1970s, there were, in Austria, I think we were at 0.2% Muslim population. You can't transform society with that. If you have more material available, and from the Muslim Brotherhood's perspective, this is truly how they see it, your chances naturally increase.
Now, specifically in Austria and Germany, the first organizational structures emerge. What kind of groups, organizations, and institutions are emerging there?
Well, in Germany, the Islamic Center Munich was founded. Simultaneously, the Muslim Student Union was established. They quickly gained their initial footholds at universities, which is connected to the fact that some of the cadres who arrived in Europe in the 1950s were students themselves. So, on the one hand, there were students from Egypt who wanted to pursue their studies in Germany. On the other hand, following Nasser's coup, there were Muslim brothers who had fled from Egypt. And these two groups together basically built the first structures. And so it was the obvious step to establish a mosque, the Islamic Center Munich, and also to build up a student organization. And starting from these two poles, over those first 30 years, the Islamic community in Germany was eventually founded, which is still considered by the Domestic Intelligence Service to be the most important organization of the Muslim Brotherhood in Germany. In Austria, as I said, the founding of the Islamic religious community in Austria, where the predecessor organization was the Muslim Social Association, I believe, yes, Social Association.
Social service
or social service. Exactly, that's right. Social service. It was actually a Bosniak association, but it also had many Arabs, including Arab students who were actively involved at that time. We don't have exact membership lists from them, but there are references in the literature indicating that Arab students were involved who were integrated into transnational Islamic networks. The only transnational Islamic network at that time was the Muslim Brotherhood. And at the same time, two truly high-ranking Muslim Brotherhood cadres were in Austria, Youssef Nada and Galeb Himmat. And it is highly probable that they were actively involved in constructing these very structures, especially since we know that Himmat was doing the same thing in Munich at the same time. Therefore, it would be utterly absurd to suggest that he remained completely uninvolved in Austria. And that's basically the setup. You then have something to start with. One has a structure from which one can then further establish oneself, grow larger, and also transnationalize this structure in the second phase.
This means the first phase really involves settling in first and establishing the initial structures.
Right.
Settle in.
Gain a foothold, exactly. Gain a foothold and get to know the country you're in. And incidentally, that's something that also emerges in their strategic papers. So we possess a hierarchical cadre apparatus, yet it grants cadres in individual regions and countries extensive autonomy when it comes to implementing the strategy for one very straightforward reason. A person based in Vienna simply understands the Viennese scene far better than someone who is merely sitting in an office in London. This means they know the local association laws, what they need to do to establish a foundation and so forth. Who are the key individuals here that I need to establish contact with? So, simply knowing the environment is very important for implementing their strategy.
And from that, the situation in Vienna naturally is also quite dependent on those very same factors. The preconditions for operating there are entirely different from those that exist in Brussels or in Paris or in England.
We see this in a simple example. An organization we broadly categorize within the Muslim Brotherhood sphere due to its more prominent role in Austria than the Brotherhood itself is Milli Görüş, the Islamic Community Milli Görüş, or the Islamic Federation in Austria. They essentially pursue the same objectives and have cooperated closely with the Muslim Brotherhood at a European level since the 1970s. Beginning in the late 80s, they embarked on a process to effectively disassociate their religious political machinery from their substantial real estate assets. So they essentially transferred their real estate holdings from the main organization into a parallel entity, but they constructed it in completely different ways in various countries. So in Austria and in Germany, these are associations. In the Netherlands, they established a foundation for it, and in France, they created a company for this purpose. Simply and purely because those were apparently the organizational structures that were better suited to manage real estate assets in those particular countries.
So that's the first phase. Now let's move to the second phase. You call it preparation for influence. What's that about?
It begins with them starting to expand their network now, essentially diversifying it. Youth organizations, scout organizations, and women's organizations are established. So separate organizations are created for different sectors. At the same time, on a European level, as I just mentioned, a transnationalization takes place. So, European umbrella organizations are founded. The Federation of Islamic Organizations in Europe is the umbrella group for organizations close to the Muslim Brotherhood in Europe, and the Islamic community in Germany was one of its founding members. A separate youth organization, the Forum of European Muslim Youth and Student Organizations, is also identified by German intelligence as a Muslim Brotherhood entity, so you can certainly label it as such without any issue. This means that the entire network is being positioned better, it's being expanded with the explicit goal, and this is precisely what we mean by preparation for influence, of transitioning from the purely adaptive behavior we observed in the initial phase to a more actively influencing approach. So now it's about establishing collaborations with churches, with NGOs, with political parties, and gradually trying to influence political decisions in the respective country in order to reshape them in the sense of Islam. They clearly state this in their strategy papers. Members are encouraged to join political parties and unions, among other organizations, to influence them in line with the tenets of Islam.
And what are the pertinent, most urgent topics when it comes to attempts to influence the non-Muslim segments of the population?
To create spaces, allowing them to build something of their own. Well, it begins with criticizing Islam, Islamophobia. This narrative, for example, is widely propagated today by many NGOs and the like. It employs a term that actually originates from these very circles, developed within them, to stifle certain debates about Islam, especially political Islamic organizations, from the discourse. Especially with regard to all politically Islamic organizations, to keep them from being excluded from public discourse. It's about, if you want to found new associations, if you want to build something, it's always good to have good political contacts. These contacts are used to be able to build up their own structures more effectively. When you collaborate with churches, NGOs, and similar organizations, you gain cooperative partners who will provide protection should you come under attack. They do it out of self-preservation, right? Because if the accusation suddenly comes up that you're working with Islamists, there are two options. You either distance yourselves from the Islamists, or you act as if nothing's amiss and attack the messenger who, so to speak, brought it to everyone's attention.
Yes, you do mention a very striking example from Austria in the book. Now, regarding the discussion around the headscarf ban for children under 14, a coalition came together. This coalition extended from state authorities through organizations affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood all the way to recognized civil society organizations. It was really a very diverse mix.
And radical left-wing organizations and even organizations closely associated with HAMAS, yes, these are the kinds of alliances that are forged, and they have a common goal: to prevent the headscarf ban in schools. So these organizations focus on, among other things, the normalization of Islamic norms. And they've been relatively quite successful at that over the last 60 years, yes.
The subject of school, generally speaking, is a very important topic. On the one hand, there are all these discussions about headscarves. On the other hand, especially from places like Great Britain and France, we constantly hear reports that certain topics can no longer be discussed in school lessons because so much pressure is being exerted by students and sometimes even by their parents. Whether it's Darwinism in biology or the Holocaust in history and similar instances. That's what this is about, exactly what's meant by exerting influence.
Exactly. You don't even have to look to France or Great Britain. We also now have this phenomenon occurring in Austria. So we're constantly speaking with teachers and school principals. This is also happening here in Viennese schools, where certain subjects, such as the Holocaust, simply cannot be taught in some classes. Because there's massive resistance from the student body. This is also true for many other topics, where parents actually show up at the school and complain. And that's what I meant at the beginning. These don't have to be members of the Muslim Brotherhood. It is simply an environment profoundly influenced by this ideology, and this ideology feels perfectly justified in demanding from the school that certain topics must absolutely not be taught. On the other hand, we know this from studies. There's one from the German sociologist Werner Schiffauer. He accompanied youth functionaries of the Milligörisch movement, and one of them tells him quite openly, "I teach the children here how to stand up against the theory of evolution in biology class." Back then, we simply sat there in silence, forced to bear it all. Now they should stand up and voice their opinions. Or I explain that they can, of course, pray at school. They're free to pray wherever they want. That is their right, so to speak. In principle, he's explaining how he arms his protégés with arguments for this cultural struggle within the school environment, that they should stand up for their Islamic norms, for their Islamic rules, and demand respect for them, and also their implementation in daily school life.
Yes, or against topics like Ramadan and so on.
And so on.
The prayer rooms, holidays, and similar narratives, yes.
And regarding the influence specifically from Germany, we also cite the study, the Mudras study has just been released again recently. It's published annually by the BKA, which is the Federal Criminal Police Office in Germany. It focuses on extremist tendencies within society, and concerning Islamism, the striking result was that among Muslims under the age of 40, approximately 45% held views that were either latently or overtly Islamist. That's a pretty large reservoir, including those with latent Islamist views. These are people who are already on their way to adopting certain elements of this ideology. And these are precisely the parents who then complain at school about certain content. Thus, you don't really need your own cadres once you've truly succeeded in heavily influencing a particular milieu with your specific ideology.
We've discussed the attempts to exert influence on non-Muslim parts of society, but naturally, influencing the Muslim community itself is also a significant part of that overall influence.
Right.
It's by no means the case that all Muslims in Austria belong to the Muslim Brotherhood or are imbued with this ideology. This means a struggle is also taking place there, so to speak, an ideological and religious battle for dominance.
Dominance and interpretive authority. That's why the Muslim population is one of our key areas of focus, because they tackle this issue centrally, largely outside of our general perception, as it often occurs within mosque communities and through non-German speaking media outlets. And they're actually attempting to explain their ideology, their norms, as being the definitive interpretation of Islam to the Muslim population. For instance, the headscarf plays a very significant and central role, establishing an obligation for Muslim women to wear it. Well, looking at Austria, studies reveal that only about a third of Muslim women who consider themselves devout actually wear a headscarf. They strive, however, to impose this headscarf as a symbolic representation, as a fundamental value upon these Muslim communities, thereby compelling women and girls into its observance. That's why there was such massive resistance to the planned and now enacted headscarf ban. For them, it's virtually about taking their specific content, including these narratives surrounding Ramadan, all these aspects deeply intertwined with Muslim life, and disseminating them centrally within Muslim communities. Their aim is to firmly establish these as prevailing norms, because it's through this process that they cultivate the specific environment they require, enabling them to then proceed with their subsequent initiatives.
Which is then projected back onto society as a whole. Society is supposed to get the picture that a Muslim is devout, prays 5 times a day, doesn't drink alcohol, fasts, and a Muslim woman simply wears a headscarf. That's just how they are. That's the image that's supposed to be solidified.
And our media are already actively participating in this. This truly demonstrates how these ideas gradually seep into the entire society. So if you read an article today about Islam or integration or anything like that, I'd estimate that in 90% of cases you'll find a woman with a headscarf found in the illustrations accompanying the article. That means this image is already conveyed. A Muslim woman wears a headscarf. And that's precisely why I also believe the headscarf is such a profoundly central aspect, something we also elaborate on in the book, because through it they can powerfully signify their presence. A Muslim woman without a headscarf basically doesn't stand out. A woman wearing a headscarf commands attention in any given space. This implies that through her, that space can be claimed, a presence clearly established, and in essence, Islam can be subtly yet effectively integrated into society. Indeed, Yusuf al-Qaradawi also addresses this very topic in his book, the concept of making Muslim life explicitly visible and gradually acclimating society to the tenets of Islam. That's essentially part of this particular project, and the headscarf plays quite a central role in it. And that's also why this influence on Muslim communities takes place, because its impact really only unfolds when there's a certain number of women wearing headscarves in society.
And then, of course, there's the interface between the non-Muslim and the Muslim society or parts of society, and that's the official Islamic associations, institutions, and organizations. Let's briefly discuss Austria, since we're on the subject. We've mentioned the Islamic religious community in Austria. What is its connection to the Muslim Brotherhood?
It's connected to the Muslim Brotherhood because at its inception, Muslim Brotherhood members were involved. Today it's relevant because in Austria we face a different situation than in France. A significant portion of Islamic immigration to Austria originated from the former Yugoslavia, specifically Bosnia, and also from Turkey. The Turkish community is by far the largest. So in this context, Arab Islam, from which the Muslim Brotherhood originated, plays a rather subordinate role. It is present here, and it also continues to play a role within the religious community. It plays a role above all because the Muslim Brotherhood was truly the sole Islamic organization that developed an internally consistent ideology right from its inception in the 1920s and 30s in Egypt. However, it was in the late 1960s and early 1970s that the Milli Görüş movement emerged in Turkey, founded by Necmettin Erbakan. This movement championed very similar objectives and held a deeply similar vision of what Islam ought to be and how a society should be structured, fundamentally rooted in an Islamic foundation. And the Milli Görüş movement is the central leading force in Austria within the Islamic religious community in Austria. Therefore, the head, the president of the religious community, Ümit Vural, himself originates from the Islamic community Milli Görüş.
So, does that mean we have to say that the official representation of Muslims here in Austria, the legal representation, is situated in a Muslim Brotherhood-affiliated ideological religious milieu at the very least?
Yes, the leadership definitely, not every mosque association. Essentially, almost all mosques are mandatorily organized within the religious community. However, for the leadership of the faith community, that is definitely true. The second largest association is ATIB. That's the association that was originally established in Austria as a mosque association directly by Diyanet, the state's official Turkish religious authority. It is still heavily dependent on Ankara, and in Ankara, this Diyanet has, I would say, been taken over by the Milli Görüş movement under President Erdogan, who himself comes from that movement. And that means that we have another association within the faith community, actually the largest of the associations within the faith community, that is also permeated by this Milli Görüş ideology. Therefore, one could say indeed, the entire leadership of the faith community is now essentially Milli Görüş, so when politicians negotiate with them, they're dealing with political Islam's representatives.
What's the situation in Germany? Laws and conditions are a bit different there. No single central legal representation exists like it does in Austria. But the organizations and associations that are considered points of contact within the Muslim community, should they be evaluated in a similar light?
They are all dominated by Milli Görüş or the Muslim Brotherhood. One must imagine it this way. Back when the Muslim labor migration to Europe first began to take shape, cadres from the various organizations were already here, or they came here from Turkey with this labor migration. They practically originated from an organized environment. In other words, they were already organized upon their arrival and immediately established their organizations right here from the very beginning. This means they were simply the first to establish any organizations at all, and therefore had a grip on the entire organized Islam in Europe.
If we are now at the close of this second phase, so to speak, allow me to briefly play devil's advocate and pose the question, what's wrong with that, though? I mean, it's totally normal that when people first immigrate here from certain countries, from certain religious backgrounds, they first have to establish themselves. And once they've achieved that, and especially when it becomes evident that, okay, they'll likely remain here permanently and can't return to their home countries as they may have initially believed or intended, it's perfectly normal for them to form associations, even religious branches. So what's the problem?
That in itself wouldn't present a problem. It certainly wasn't a major issue with any immigration wave in the past or in other nations. The real problem we're facing here is that these aren't just ordinary people from these countries, founding groups here. And then typically, a really significant experiment in essence was the Manhattan Project, New York, where immigration waves kept coming, Italians, Irish, Jews, Germans, Chinese, and so on, all of whom ultimately ended up in the Lower East Side and from there essentially made their ascent into American society. This means that by the second or third generation, we don't really find these immigrants in the same sense anymore. Yes, they still identify as Italian American, but they're Americans. They no longer speak Italian and generally lack strong ties to Italy. Perhaps during a World Cup, they might gather at a local pub to cheer for Italy, but essentially, they are Americans first and foremost. However, in this situation, we are encountering groups where organization and cadres arrive simultaneously, bringing an ideology that they utilize to exert influence on these immigrant communities, specifically these Muslim immigrant communities, and to actively prevent that very integration from occurring. They truly don't want them to integrate here. Instead, they prefer them to remain as segregated Islamic communities within our society, allowing them to gradually expand this Islamic sphere over time. So their project isn't to integrate into society, but rather to integrate society into their ideology in the long term. And that, I believe, is a problem.
These are the initial two phases we've covered until now, specifically the settlement phase and the phase involving the exertion of influence. The third phase, which you then discuss, is termed destabilization. What exactly should we understand by that?
In this specific case, when we refer to the Muslim Brotherhood and this particular type of hybrid conflict, we define destabilization as any action designed to undermine or disrupt individual areas of activity, to intentionally destroy or fundamentally alienate the original function of that particular field of action. So, take the education sector, for example. It's its own area of action. When it's no longer possible in schools to teach according to the planned curriculum in the manner it was intended, that's when we truly begin to enter the phase of destabilization. Then a field of action is simply alienated from its original purpose, and thereby effectively destabilized. And in the education sector, which I can perhaps elaborate on further right now, we're already witnessing these tendencies in Austria too. However, it must be said that not everything that leads to destabilization can be directly attributed to the actions of political Islamic organizations. Many other factors come into play here. Through the immigration since 2015, we've massively overtaxed our education system, particularly in urban areas and in certain districts, like in Vienna, for example. If I have a class where 70 to 80% of the children don't speak sufficient German, then it's perfectly clear that I can't teach normally there. So destabilization is happening there in a different way. However, it is then utilized by political Islamic actors. This is because a school that is already operating at the very edge of its capacities can, of course, be much more easily influenced from the outside. It will simply evade any further conflict. So if there are children in a classroom who say, "We don't want that," then what you're telling us here about Jews or the Holocaust, and they resist, this resistance will very quickly lead to success. Simply because teachers in these schools are already overwhelmed, they don't want to deal with that as well.
All these matters we're discussing, as we've noted before, aren't developments that are unfolding synchronously across the entirety of Europe. Rather, they're shaped by the specific local conditions and circumstances. And the situation is that there are countries, regions within countries, and sometimes even regions within cities that are already much further along, so to speak, than in other places. For example, if we look at Great Britain, where parts of the legal system have effectively been circumvented and an Islamic or Islamist alternative justice system is in practice. These are examples of these situations.
However, it's important to note that in Great Britain, this is also state-sanctioned. Thus, there exist Sharia councils for family law matters installed by the state. This, in my opinion, presents a grave issue. By doing so, you are effectively empowering these very organizations. You merely need to observe who presides over these Sharia councils, granting them authority over Muslim communities, which is a serious concern. Of course, they always say that if a woman is not satisfied with the Sharia council's divorce ruling, she can still go to a civil court. However, a woman residing in a relatively secluded community, and this increasingly holds true for entire regions across Great Britain today, will simply not be able to call upon a civil court without being ostracized from her entire social circle, if not worse. That really involves a great deal. In essence, power over a specific aspect of law within Muslim communities has been relinquished to those involved in political Islam. But we also see this phenomenon in other countries now, not officially, but where conflicts are resolved internally within the community, where there are also so-called Sharia judges or conflict mediators and the like, from the state as well. Power is taken from the state, and that power essentially flows into the hands of political Islamic actors. However, in major cities in France or Sweden, there are entire areas where the state essentially has no control anymore. So when state authorities want to carry out a simple police action or a simple social services action, for example, a case of child welfare endangerment, they want to remove a child from a family, they have to send in entire tactical units to do so. Then you've effectively lost control of that neighborhood since you can't be there. To have a substantial police presence there on site, this means they only have power when they go in with hundreds of officers. Otherwise, they have no power. That's societal destabilization.
There are also two additional phases that you have either identified or adopted from the theory of hybrid conflict or warfare, correct? But you write in the book that this is... So, everything we've talked about up to this point, we're not speaking about speculation, but rather about matters that can be verified in black and white from documents, or about societal changes that are observable to all of us. The other two phases, namely confrontation and power takeover, as you yourselves wrote, are much more reliant on speculation because we haven't reached them yet. Still, what can you at least hint at about what the contours of these phases might look like?
It's a good thing we're not there yet, because we probably couldn't have written the book if we were, or we'd be facing much bigger problems. No, we still have clues from their strategy papers on what they will do next. The problem we are facing is precisely what kind of state they envision and how it is supposed to appear. No documents exist for that yet, so it's still open. The ultimate goal, a global caliphate, is essentially the political utopia located somewhere on the distant horizon, quite similar to the communist world revolution. But on one hand, we have what they've written about their intentions. And from what they've done so far, we can of course draw conclusions about what the next step is. So what would be the logical next step they would have to take? And the fourth phase is the phase of confrontation, where they increasingly switch to confrontation in the individual fields of action. So we already have a certain destabilization in some areas, let's say in the education sector, or in the state and its institutions through infiltration, where individuals are strategically positioned. In Austria, there was an incident involving a DSN employee who was clearly trying to gather information for the Muslim Brotherhood.
Perhaps we should explain for our viewers in Germany. Last year, a case emerged where an employee, in principle from the state security apparatus, was uncovered for having leaked sensitive information to the Muslim Brotherhood, specifically concerning ongoing investigations into their activities.
In principle, it's unimaginable, but it didn't surprise me because that's their goal, to get inside such agencies. We know Muslim Brotherhood members are in many other agencies. And through this infiltration, which starts as influence, it of course becomes destabilization in the long run. If we consider there's not just one state security employee, but several, then they are of course absolutely capable of destabilizing this agency, thus significantly reducing its capacity to actively combat Islamism, specifically by leaking details of planned house searches, by making information disappear, or by passing other information to the outside. So you can essentially destabilize your own agency from within. And the next phase is the phase of confrontation, where you no longer do this secretly, but openly demand things and go on a confrontational course. And that is essentially the logical next step if you want to reach the point where you ultimately support society and the state to your advantage. To transform them, then you must eventually transition from a silent influencing approach to a mode of direct confrontation.
Is that a phase? I mean, we're definitely not at that point in Austria. No, we're not. Can this phenomenon be observed anywhere, like in a test tube environment?
Well, we already have examples of this from the early days of the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1930s and 1940s. And we would assume that this will eventually happen in Europe if these phases can continue to be worked through without any problems. She established an armed party apparatus akin to the armed formations created by other ideological movements during the 1920s. With that, you can of course do much more to further destabilize the entire situation. You can no longer just defame opponents, you can concretely threaten and even eliminate them if necessary. That's what this secret apparatus, as they called it, did. You can engage in armed conflicts, carry out attacks. Indeed, you can do everything conceivable to continue destabilizing society and the state from within. And in Egypt, as I said, we saw this. From their perspective, they acted too soon. They challenged the state power they were not yet a match for, and it almost led to their destruction at the time. So before they move into that phase, they'll be very cautious and consider it carefully, given their historical experience. But it is to be expected that this is ultimately part of their plan.
Now, a phenomenon that immediately springs to my mind as I was reading this naturally is once again the issue of the cartoons, or the so-called cartoon controversies, or more generally, the fact that it has actually become life-threatening for critics of Islamism to exist, even within Europe, and that it's just no longer possible for them without having police protection around the clock. The truly scandalous situation is that we've silently resigned ourselves to the fact that an entire group of people in European states, including Germany, France, Austria, and elsewhere, can de facto only live under police protection. Otherwise, they would simply be attacked or even killed. These are indeed striking examples of such a predicament.
And these are just the prominent cases that actually get brought to public attention. Individuals who were not prominent until then, such as Samuel Paty, the teacher in France who was publicly beheaded by a jihadist. Nobody knew beforehand they'd need police protection. This is how they deal with opponents. Opponents of Islamism are one of their key areas, where the whole Islamophobia discourse plays a significant role. But then they do move on. They don't perpetrate violence themselves. The Muslim Brotherhood did not commit these violent acts. But what they do relatively openly now is mark individual opponents as targets, knowing full well what that means for these people. Thus, if I were to suggest that a Muslim like Ahmad Mansour is no longer a genuinely true Muslim, then as someone from these organizations, from the Muslim Brotherhood, I know very well how that is seen. More extreme, more radical circles. The act of leaving the faith, renouncing one's faith, is a crime punishable by death there. And by doing so, I'm effectively marking him as a target for other perpetrators. Afterward, I can always claim, we unequivocally reject this violence and distance ourselves from it completely, asserting that it was not good, and so forth. But ultimately, it is from these very circles that campaigns emerge, explicitly targeting individuals for elimination. That's precisely what occurred with Samuel Paty in France. The campaign against him, initiated by Muslim Brotherhood circles, was waged for days, even weeks, until it culminated in this act of violence.
Or like the example of the cartoon controversy, where naturally organizations such as the faith community or similar groups wouldn't directly incite or involve themselves in violence. But of course the implicit threats that were always there, sort of like, yes, if you publish cartoons like that, then one shouldn't be surprised when hot-headed individuals overreact to such things. So with that implicit threat, there's a manipulative twist in the discourse they're promoting.
They use the violence. The violence of jihadists is used in the second and also in the third phase for two things. Firstly, it is actually employed to propagate fear, without having to become active themselves, that is, actively violent, without having to break any laws themselves. They play with this violence and use it for propaganda for one thing or another. So don't say anything bad about Islam, don't say anything bad about Muhammad, don't draw cartoons of Muhammad. And on the other hand, they use it again to be able to distance themselves from this very violence and say, we are the peaceful ones, you have to work with us. And that's why, interestingly, we find Muslim Brotherhood affiliates in prevention projects, which always makes me think that doesn't really fit. We wouldn't use someone from the identitarian movement to dissuade violent right-wing extremists from violence. But in the area of Islamism, that's exactly what we do.
You include a very telling quote in your book from a Muslim Brotherhood official who states, and I'll read it, "We've come to realize that the West is rather short-sighted, and fundamentally they demand just three distinct things from us: financial contributions, electoral support, and simply not being Osama bin Laden." This implies that as long as you're not personally creating threatening videos with a Kalashnikov or committing acts of terrorism, you gain state acceptance, even when essentially propagating a legalistic form of Islamism.
This stems from a historical cause. It was truly following the 9/11 attacks and then the ones in 2003 and 2004 in Madrid and the UK that both politicians and civil society began seeking out Muslim partners who could firstly explain what was actually going on. So, in addition to Islamic studies, Muslim organizations were suddenly highly sought after to help prevent such acts of violence in the future. And as I just mentioned, organized Islam in Europe is largely shaped by the Muslim Brotherhood. Organizations with close ties to the Muslim Brotherhood largely dominate this organized form of Islam. This means that from the very beginning, they automatically turned to these organizations as partners and didn't really look any closer at where they actually come from or what they really stand for. I believe German intelligence reports are unread by politicians. It's nice that they're being produced, but they just end up in a drawer somewhere because then medals of honor or other awards are given to members of these organizations. Chancellor candidates campaign at Miligorish mosques, and you always wonder, don't you know what you're doing? And I think they just started down this path and don't really know how to get out of it. And they're now scared of alienating these groups because they represent a significant voter base. So that's the next thing, the votes. So you show that you are not violent and you bring them votes.
There are now political parties, predominantly on the political left, that very openly and aggressively pursue these agendas. Well, in France they call it Islamo-Gauchisme, referring to all the criticism, be it Islamic or Islamist in nature. Groups, segments of society, and simply garner their votes to build up their political power.
La France Insoumise does this very openly, this collaboration. This has existed on the far left for a long time. Back when the RAF disbanded, a successor organization, an anti-imperialist group, I don't know, coordination or something. No, I don't remember exactly what they were called.
Anti-imperialist cells.
And they put out an exploratory paper back then where they very openly stated that one must collaborate with Islamist forces. This tradition has long existed on the far left, but it's now deeply ingrained even in social democracy. It might not be as openly stated there, but it's happening. They don't say we work with Islamists, but they do it. Within Austrian social democracy, several members are also members of military organizations. That should really be mutually exclusive, but there's obviously no resolution on incompatibility within the SPÖ. And I suspect it's even worse. They don't even know that these people are also in the Milligörisch movement, or they don't know what the Milligörisch movement actually is.
Whether we get to these last two phases, namely phase of confrontation and especially power seizure, whatever that means in detail, of course doesn't just depend on what the Muslim Brotherhood, its organizations and structures do. Instead, it very much depends on how the general society reacts to it and how it chooses to deal with it. And this differs significantly between countries. The UK is a very different case compared to Austria in recent years.
In Great Britain, to perhaps go back to the previous question, the Green Party there has been infiltrated by Islamists, where blatant anti-Semitism and openly pro-Hamas rhetoric is preached. One could almost say that some of the candidates running for the Greens are actually preachers. This infiltration has truly taken hold, has been completely successful there. So in large parts of Great Britain, you can now consider the color of the Green Party to be Islamic green.
Yes, we saw it in Sweden, where a member of the Green Party's executive committee was from the Muslim Brotherhood. What does it look like there now? Right, I'm interpreting what you've written, and it seems like you come across quite favorably in your assessment. So, in that sense, you're saying that the problem has at least been partially identified and at least initial measures have been taken to address it. And if I'm understanding correctly, it all comes back to money once again. In terms of funding these structures for their ongoing upkeep.
At the very least, I'd say we should start with money, specifically cutting public funding for Islamist organizations. I don't know if Austria is that good yet. What has happened in Austria with the Documentation Center Political Islam is very overt. The state has installed an agency saying, we have observation centers for right-wing extremism, we also need one for Islamic extremism. And it exists. And on the other hand, that naturally has the effect that they also feel observed. This center, I believe, has published some very good papers. They've published materials explaining current events in Austria, active organizations, and their operations. You're putting them on a stage, in the spotlight, and that's precisely what an actor in a hybrid conflict doesn't want. They invariably prefer to operate behind the curtain, if you will, ensuring their actions cannot be immediately traced back to them, nor will there be any clear explanation detailing where these actions are actually leading or what their ultimate objective truly is. So, in that sense, just this observation itself is already something that hinders further progress. Simultaneously, with measures like the headscarf ban, you can observe that there's now a growing awareness of the dynamics within Muslim communities and a push to regulate these developments. I genuinely believe that this constant pressure leads to many things being considerably more restrained here compared to other nations. For example, after October 7th, we didn't have these demonstrations here like in London, on the streets of Paris, or even in parts of Berlin. We didn't have any prayers in mosques here anymore, not like before. The regular services, the gatherings for prayer, they simply weren't happening, where the Turkish army was being cheered on, which was very much the case in German mosques. They are more restrained here because they know they are under observation. However, I don't yet see them genuinely facing obstacles that would significantly impede their progress, as there's simply no consistent counter-strategy. They just do a little tweaking here and a little tweaking there. However, the very nature of a hybrid actor dictates that it will adapt to this constant adjustment, modify its strategy, and then endeavor to become active again from a different angle. So, when it's blocked from one direction, it backs off and then approaches anew from another side. What's simply missing is, and this was one reason we wrote the book first, a recognition that we are actually dealing with an actor that acts strategically, has a clear strategy, and follows it. To effectively stop them, a clear and consistent counter-strategy must be developed. This strategy shouldn't just focus on isolated areas, but should be comprehensively implemented across all fields of action to truly halt and push them back. And I don't see that in any European country now, not even in Austria. Austria's starting position is better than in France or Sweden.
Although you can't really talk about consistency there, you just mentioned the Documentation Center Political Islam, and they also had, among other things, back when they were founded, and I quote this in the book as well, there are chats from circles close to the Muslim Brotherhood saying, if this gets institutionalized, if this truly comes to pass, then we are completely finished. Then we're done for. But unfortunately, that's not entirely the case. For instance, this documentation center might issue a report on milligörisch. However, that doesn't prevent politicians and the state from persisting in their cooperation with that very same religious community, milligörisch, across all conceivable sectors.
That's the problem. It's the same as Germany's constitutional protection reports. Some of them, like in North Rhine-Westphalia, contain things that are really detailed and very open, but which apparently don't concern North Rhine-Westphalia's politicians if they've even read them. So we basically need two steps. First, that this is widely recognized. And by widely recognized, I don't mean individual politicians, but that it's recognized across all state institutions and parties that we are dealing with someone there who wants a different society, who basically wants to abolish our liberal democracy, our rule of law in the long run. And we must firmly stand against that and then actually think and act in a truly strategic manner. Not in election cycles. The Muslim Brotherhood doesn't think in such terms. They think in Vatican-like dimensions. As long as politicians only think as far as the next election, it's not going to work out.
But who are they? If we're talking on the political level, who are the potential partners for such a, well, fight is too strong a word, but for such a confrontation? Because the problem is what we have in Germany, what we have in Austria, that essentially it is only the far-right parties that entirely appropriate the entire topic of political Islam, whether it's the AfD in Germany or the FPO in Austria. Otherwise, you're pretty much on your own if you don't want to team up with the right-wing extremists.
Well, yes, this is essentially a self-created problem. For decades, this issue itself has been virtually ignored, especially over the last 25 years, since it really flared up after 9/11. This essentially handed the right, not just the far right, but right-wing parties in general, a unique selling point concerning migration, political Islam, and Islamism. Now we are facing the consequences of this. And now it faces the situation where people, even openly from left-wing circles, are saying that's a right-wing issue. They're essentially disowning it, calling it a right-wing issue. Then, as I've already pointed out, there's the increasing Muslim population, which has now also become a substantial Muslim voting demographic. Left-leaning parties, precisely for these reasons, have garnered a Muslim voter base, which is fundamentally illogical, because if these people originate from a politically Islamic environment, then we are, in essence, confronting an arch-conservative audience who really can't quite relate to things like LGBTQ plus rights and so on. Well, it actually speaks against their party program. But they've bound these people to themselves because they, in essence, actively collaborated in ensuring that Islam and political Islam weren't discussed within society or were only debated among the far right. And now, of course, there's the palpable fear of losing this crucial voter potential if they position themselves differently on this issue. And then I also think that, especially among those on the left, ideology is truly standing in their way. They've become so deeply immersed in these intricate theories, identity politics, post-colonialism and the like, and they've identified with them so profoundly that it actively obstructs their ability to acknowledge the presence of another group entirely, one that desires something completely distinct from their own agenda. It's an ideology that actually contradicts everything they themselves do, because they tend to view it as, well, this is the Muslim minority that we essentially have to protect. And historically, they've always been seen as the downtrodden, which of course isn't actually true. So we're talking about centuries of Islamic imperialism that are truly, truly behind us, weighing heavily on our history. But people have, in a sense, landed ideologically on the wrong track and either don't know how to get off it or simply don't want to, because ultimately they might themselves reject the existing society and its established order. This is a crucial point to understand.
I think we can slowly bring this to a close. Therefore, to finish, I have a rather general question, which may not be entirely easy to answer. How dangerous are Muslim Brotherhood affiliated or Muslim Brotherhood-like structures currently in Austria, and how do they compare especially to other countries? Where do you perceive the most significant threat originating from these particular structures and these specific political undertakings?
The greatest danger, in fact, is this gradual unfolding, this slow development that's occurring, which is progressively causing alterations in how society coexists and, more broadly, in the fundamental values of society as a whole. Let's revisit the education sector. Children attending schools today, those being introduced to Islam within schools, will undoubtedly harbor a starkly different perception of it once they've reached adulthood. For them, it's just normal. So it essentially happens over time. That's what I mean by thinking in terms of generations, in Vatican dimensions. You don't transform a society in a day, you transform a society over many generations. And this is what Yusuf al-Qaradawi refers to when he talks about familiarizing society with Islam, getting accustomed to the Islamic presence, and adapting to Islamic normative systems. This happens gradually and almost insidiously, and the further this process advances, the more difficult it will be to contain it again. And I truly believe that in certain European nations, while I wouldn't forecast this for Austria just yet, I definitely foresee it for France and also for Great Britain, a complete and utter reversal or pushback is, quite frankly, no longer feasible at this current juncture. The only thing that's really possible right now is to somehow maintain the existing status quo, prevent it from deteriorating further in the near future, and then to figure out how to reverse that trend in the long run. But when I already have entire regions that are Islamically dominated, we actually undertook a parallel project alongside the main book, and parts of that research flowed into it, which was specifically focused on future projections. Therefore, if one does not take action, it is highly probable that in the near future, specifically within the next 10 to 15 years, a Lebanonization of urban areas will occur in several European nations. This means that I'll actually have fully self-contained communities that are also spatially segregated from one another. And the problem with such a structure, as exemplified by Lebanon, is this. When I have clear demarcation lines between ethnic or religious communities, these boundaries are invariably, and historically always have been, potential flashpoints for violence. Outbreaks of violence don't have to occur there, but the probability is relatively high that violence will erupt along such dividing lines. So what truly awaits us if we don't take action is a permanent state of potentially civil war-like conditions within our densely populated urban areas.
Well, at this point, I truly want to extend my thanks to you for the hour we've spent discussing things together. So thank you very much for being our guest. And to all of you, our viewers, as always, if you find our videos interesting and wish to support our work, please consider subscribing to our channel, comment on our videos, and leave a thumbs up. Otherwise, thank you for your attention, and until next time.
Mena-Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Think Tank. Besuchen Sie auch unsere Website. Dort finden Sie täglich neue aktuelle Berichte und ausführliche wissenschaftlich fundierte Hintergrundanalysen zur Geschichte und Gegenwart der MENA-Region.